It was the fall of 2020 when the Harrison estate, a 150-year-old mansion nestled in the rolling outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, was undergoing restoration. Time had worn away the edges of its southern charm paint, peeled from ornate moldings, vines strangled the iron gates, and cobwebs dusted crystal chandeliers that hadn't sparkled in decades. The workers had just begun tearing down the third-floor guest wing, long abandoned since the late 70s, when demolition crew member Leo Mathers struck something unexpected behind a floor-length mirror. It didn't echo like drywall. It echoed like air. "Hey, get over here!" Leo called out, prying the frame loose. Behind the mirror was a narrow, concealed space, almost like a forgotten linen closet. But it was sealed, no hinges, no doorknob. With the help of crowbars, the men forced it open. Dust exploded outward. Inside, illuminated by flashlight beams slicing through the gloom, sat a small wooden box, draped in faded lace and layered with decades of silence. Leo lifted the box and popped it open. Inside, a worn leather-bound diary, a pearl-studded locket, a yellowed photograph of a young Hispanic woman in a maid's uniform, smiling eyes full of light, and a crimson silk handkerchief stained dark in one corner. They handed it all to the estate's owner, Edward Harrison, who had inherited the mansion after the passing of his grandmother, Eileen Harrison, the estate's matriarch. Edward turned pale when he saw the name on the diary's inside cover. Property of Maria Alvarez, July 1975. Across town, Isabel Vega, 30, sat alone in her cramped apartment, watching the early morning news while sipping coffee from a chipped mug. She was a freelance investigative journalist by trade, currently between contracts, currently without direction. Then the headline appeared: Mansion Restoration Crew discovers hidden room containing belongings of missing maid from 1975. She sat up straight, her breath hitched. Maria Alvarez. That name wasn't just a news relic, it was blood. Maria was Isabel's great-aunt, a ghost that had haunted whispered family stories for decades. Everyone said Maria vanished in 1975, left behind her job, maybe ran off, maybe deported, maybe, worse. The family never spoke of it in detail, just shameful glances and broken Spanish sentences that ended with, "Pero no sabemos." But Isabel had always wondered. And now, this. She reached for her phone and called the number on the news screen. Savannah Historical Society. The receptionist informed her the items were now with Detective Alan Briggs, head of cold case reinvestigations. 2 days later, Isabel sat across from Detective Briggs in a quiet interview room at the precinct. He was a man in his mid-50s with a thinning hairline, horn-rimmed glasses, and a calm, clinical demeanor. "We've never had solid leads on the Maria Alvarez case," he said. "But this discovery, it changes things." He placed the diary on the table between them, wearing gloves. "You're listed as next of kin on file. You're her only surviving relative willing to cooperate." Isabel nodded, hands trembling slightly. "May I?" she asked. He passed her the diary. The leather was cracked and soft from age. She opened it gently, pages stiff, yellowed but intact. The first entry, July 12, 1975. "It's been 6 months since I started working for the Harrisons. Mrs. Harrison is kind but distant. Mr. Harrison watches me when he thinks I don't notice." Isabel's mouth went dry. "Sometimes he leaves things for me, flowers, chocolate, but I never say anything. I need this job." Detective Briggs gave her a moment. "Do you remember your family ever mentioning this? Any suspicion?" "No one ever talked about it," she whispered. "I was just a baby when she disappeared. My mother always said Maria was too beautiful for her own good. That's all she'd ever say." Briggs nodded solemnly. "Well, that matches what we're seeing." He pointed to the silk handkerchief. "We had the blood tested. Preliminary results indicate it's human, female, and recent upgrades in DNA matching systems mean we might be able to confirm whether it's Maria's." Isabel stared at the objects on the table. What else had been locked behind that mirror for 45 years? With permission from Briggs and ownership cooperation, Isabel was allowed to return to the Harrison estate, somewhere she had never set foot but always pictured in shadows. She stood now before the mansion's towering double doors. Ivy curled around the columns like clenched fingers. The house groaned with the weight of old secrets. Edward Harrison greeted her himself. He was in his early 60s, composed, rich in posture, but dry in presence. He extended a hand. "I suppose we're family of a sort," he said. Isabel didn't take the hand. "Just here for the truth." Edward didn't flinch. Then let me show you the house. They walked through silent halls coated in dust and antique tension. Every creaking floorboard felt like a memory-resisting revival. When they reached the third floor, where the diary had been discovered, Isabel froze. This was where Maria had once cleaned, where she had smiled, where she had bled. I'm told this wing was sealed off after 1978, Isabel said. Edward nodded. My grandmother claimed it brought bad energy. Or guilt, Isabel said flatly. That night, Isabel stayed in a small hotel by the edge of town. She placed Maria's diary on the desk, opened a fresh notebook, and began charting everything. She'd write this story. She'd finish what Maria had never been able to tell. She read further into the diary. One entry stood out. August 9, 1975. Tonight, I heard Mrs. Harrison crying behind her door. Mr. Harrison left angry after dinner. Later, he came to my room. I locked the door. I always lock the door. But what if one day I forget? Isabel shivered. The next morning, Isabel returned to the mansion alone. Edward had left town for a board meeting, and the restoration crew wasn't scheduled until later in the week. She stepped through the front doors with permission, and a key Detective Briggs had arranged. The house was quieter now, not abandoned, but suspended in a strange half-life. Dust still lay in the corners, but sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows, casting fractured patterns on the parquet floor. Isabel walked slowly toward the third-floor corridor where Maria's diary had been found. She paused at the edge of the hallway. This part of the house was cold, unnaturally so, and every step on the creaking wood sent echoes down the long hall. She found herself in front of the mirror well, the space where it had once been. The wall had been patched temporarily with plywood. She touched the frame where the edges had been. Something about the shape of the wall behind it bothered her. She stepped back and noticed a faint indentation across the baseboard, like a small door had once existed, closed tightly for decades. She took out her phone and snapped a few pictures. Then she turned and entered the nearest guest room, the one Maria had been assigned according to the diary. The wallpaper was faded, the air musty. A single brass bed stood in the center of the room, stripped bare. Isabel walked around slowly, eyes scanning. The floorboards near the vanity creaked louder than others. She knelt and examined them, pressing gently. One of them gave slightly. She pulled at the edge and it shifted, revealing a hollow beneath. Reaching in, she pulled out a small tin box. It was rusted but intact. Inside were several photographs of folded letters and a single rosary, its chain broken. The photographs showed Maria with another woman laughing, arms around each other. Isabel didn't recognize the other woman, but one of the letters was addressed to D, written in Spanish, in Maria's hand. Isabel translated in her head as she read, I wish things were different. I wish you would stop asking me to leave. I cannot go anywhere. They will not let me. The mistress knows. She saw us. Last week she threatened me. She said if I didn't disappear, she would. Isabel's heart raced. She read the line again. She said if I didn't disappear, she would. Who was D and what did the mistress see? She took pictures of everything, then gently replaced the items. As she stood, something shifted in the shadows behind her. A faint creak, like weight on a floorboard. She turned quickly. Nothing. But the feeling lingered. Later that afternoon, Isabel visited the Savannah Public Records Office. With some help from an archivist, she pulled up census records, employment files, and news articles from 1975. Maria Alvarez had been hired by the Harrisons in January of that year. Her paperwork listed no next of kin in the country. There were no police reports filed about her disappearance. No missing persons case. Nothing official at all. She searched local news clippings. In September 1975, there was a brief notice. Maria Alvarez, maid employed at Harrison Estate, has reportedly returned to Mexico, according to a statement from Eileen Harrison. A lie. Detective Briggs had already run background checks. There was no border crossing record, no plane ticket, no bank withdrawals. Maria had not left. She had vanished. Isabel kept digging. The archivist returned with an old photograph from a charity gala held at the Harrison Estate in August 1975. Isabel examined it carefully. Among the guests was Maria, partially visible in the background, tray in hand. Beside her, smiling warmly, stood a young woman with chestnut hair. The same woman from Maria's private photographs. The back of the image read, Daphne Caldwell, family friend. There she was, D. Isabel jotted the name and left immediately. An online search turned up an address in Charleston. Daphne Caldwell, now 67, living quietly in a modest brick home near the water. Isabel didn't call, she just drove. 3 hours later, she stood on Daphne's porch. her hands shaking as she rang the bell. A woman opened the door slowly, cautiously. Time had aged her gently. Her eyes were sad but sharp. Yes or no, she asked. I think you knew my great-aunt, Isabel said. Maria Alvarez. Daphne went still. Her hand tightened on the edge of the door. I was hoping you'd come someday, she whispered. Daphne invited her inside and led her to a small sitting room filled with books and plants. She sat on the edge of an armchair, hands folded. I couldn't say anything, she said. Not then. Not when it mattered most. Say it now, Isabel urged. Daphne's eyes glossed over. I loved her, she said simply. We both did. But back then, it wasn't safe. Not for two women, and especially not for someone like her. A maid, a woman of color. She was already invisible in that world. She looked away. Eileen Harrison caught us. She saw us in the garden one night. Nothing happened, just a kiss. But that was enough. She called Maria into the drawing room the next day. I was downstairs and I heard yelling. Then, silence. Daphne wiped a tear. I never saw Maria again. They told me she'd left, that she'd gone back to Mexico. But I didn't believe them. I searched for weeks. Then Eileen threatened to cut ties with my family. Said she'd ruin me. And Mr. Harrison? Isabel asked. Coward, Daphne muttered. He knew. He said it wasn't his business. Isabel showed her the diary. Daphne touched it like it was a holy object. She used to write at night. I never knew where she kept it. Isabel opened to the August 9th entry. Daphne read the lines, then leaned back. I begged her to leave, but she said she was scared. She said Eileen had promised to make her disappear quietly. I thought it was a threat. You didn't think she meant it literally, Isabel finished. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Daphne reached for Isabel's hand. I don't know if you can get justice, she said, but tell her story. Let people know she lived, that she mattered. I will, Isabel said. When she returned to Savannah that evening, she called Detective Briggs. She told him everything about Daphne, the letter, the threat. I think it's time we search the estate more thoroughly, Briggs said. If Maria's body was never moved, it's still there. Where? Isabel asked. My guess, Briggs said, voice low. Behind the walls they don't want us to see. 2 days later, the police arrived at the Harrison estate with a warrant. Isabel stood just beyond the gates, watching as 2 squad cars, a forensics van, and Detective Briggs in his rumpled blazer moved up the gravel driveway toward the mansion. The fall breeze stirred the Spanish moss hanging from the oak trees. Everything felt too quiet, like the house was holding its breath. Edward Harrison had returned from his business trip that morning. He was already waiting in the foyer, expression tight, voice clipped. This is absurd, he snapped as Briggs stepped inside. You've been given everything we found. Actually, we think you haven't, Briggs replied calmly. The diary suggests that the victim, Maria Alvarez, may have been harmed inside this house. We're executing a search of the walls and floorboards of the 3rd floor. You'll damage the woodwork, Edward hissed. If your grandmother didn't kill a woman in this house, then you've got nothing to worry about, Isabel said flatly, stepping into the room. Edward's eyes narrowed at her. You don't belong here. This was her last home, Isabel replied. I belong here more than you do. Briggs gestured to the crew. They began their sweep studying blueprints, measuring wall thicknesses, tapping panels. It didn't take long. In Maria's old bedroom, a young technician ran his hand along the western wall behind the closet. Something's off, he said. There's a dead space between the studs, 4 feet wide, 8 feet tall. The team got to work. The paneling was old but cracked easily under careful pressure. A hidden section of the wall gave way. Behind it was a cavity, a narrow vertical crawl space. Inside, curled into the fetal position on a decaying blanket, was a human skeleton. The silk-made scarf, identical to the one in the diary box, was still wrapped loosely around the wrist bones. A hush fell over the room. Isabel felt her knees weaken. Briggs stepped forward slowly, pulling on gloves. He shone a flashlight over the remains. The bones were dry. No signs of a struggle in the cavity, just the small blanket, the position, and the unmistakable stench of long-ago death. He turned to Edward, who had turned pale. Is this where she died? Briggs asked. Edward didn't answer. The forensics team began carefully extracting the remains. The skull was intact, the teeth well preserved enough for a dental record match. Around the neck was a thin silver chain, the cross still faintly gleaming. Isabel turned away, her hand to her mouth. A wave of grief rolled over her, not just for Maria, But for all the years she'd been hidden like this, forgotten, left to rot behind plaster and secrets. Later downstairs, Briggs confronted Edward in the study. "Did you know?" he asked. Edward's voice was hollow. "I didn't know she was in the wall." "But you knew something," Briggs said. Edward sat heavily in the antique armchair once owned by his grandmother. "My father told me never to ask about Maria. He said she left. But my grandmother, she hated her. She said she was a stain on this family. I was just a boy." He looked at Isabel. "When they sealed that hallway, I asked her why. She said it was cursed, that it was where sins were punished. She had the third floor sealed in '78. No one was allowed up there." Isabel stepped forward, her voice steady. "You could have unsealed it at any time." Edward looked ashamed. "I was afraid of what I might find." A week later, DNA confirmed the remains belonged to Maria Alvarez. Her name was officially removed from the missing persons list. The state reclassified her death as a homicide. The cause was undetermined due to skeletal deterioration, but the positioning suggested confinement, possibly asphyxiation. No arrest was made. Eileen Harrison had died in 1999. But that wasn't the end. Briggs discovered an estate logbook among Mrs. Harrison's old belongings, archived in a locked desk drawer. In it, a single entry from August 11, 1975. "Maria knows too much. Her presence is a risk. Tomorrow I will remove the temptation for good. Let no one say I didn't try kindness first." That sentence was enough. The state issued a formal declaration. Maria Alvarez was a victim of unlawful confinement leading to death. The Harrison estate was publicly condemned for historical abuse, and the Savannah Historical Society launched a full audit of legacy properties owned by the family. Isabel didn't feel vindicated, not yet. Not until Maria had her name carved in stone. She arranged for a burial, something simple, beautiful, dignified. A plot was chosen in a peaceful cemetery surrounded by Spanish oak trees, not far from the mansion. Dozens showed up. Former staff, advocates for migrant workers, local journalists, and Daphne Caldwell standing quietly with a bouquet of yellow lilies. Isabel stood beside the casket, holding Maria's diary in her hands. "She was only 25, Isabel said softly. "She had dreams. She loved deeply. She was betrayed. But today we give her back what was taken, her dignity, her truth, and her name." She stepped forward and placed the diary gently inside the coffin. As it closed, it felt like a door, long hidden, was finally opening again. Isabel didn't return to the mansion for several days. After the burial, she stayed home, the weight of everything she'd uncovered settling like dust on her shoulders. Maria's voice lingered in her mind, the diary entries, the fear, the longing, the hope. Every night she read one page before bed, as if speaking to a ghost who had waited too long to be heard. But the silence didn't last. Word of the discovery had spread quickly. A journalist friend forwarded her a headline from a national outlet. "Decades-old diary unlocks forgotten murder in Southern Mansion." Requests came in from publishers, true crime producers, even a documentary team in New York. But Isabel said no to all of them. Not yet. Not until she finished what she started. She returned to the mansion the following week, this time alone. The front door creaked open with the same resistant groan, but something felt different. Lighter, like the house had exhaled. The mirrors had been taken down, the third floor unsealed, the false walls exposed. She walked slowly through the halls, stopping only when she reached the main stairwell. There on the landing hung a single black and white portrait of Eileen Harrison. Isabel stared at it for a long time. The face of a woman who had smiled for cameras and charities, who hosted galas and sponsored orphanages, and who behind closed doors had chosen cruelty over compassion. "You don't win," Isabel whispered. She climbed to the third floor. Sunlight streamed in now through the high windows. The corridor was clean, the dust swept, the carpet removed. Only bare floors remained, wood scarred from years of silence. She entered Maria's room. It was empty now, but the air didn't feel haunted anymore, just quiet. She stepped inside and knelt at the far wall, where the secret cavity had been. A soft knock sounded behind her. She turned. It was Edward. He looked smaller than before, less polished, more human. "I wanted to speak with you," he said, stepping inside. "If you'll let me." Isabel stood slowly. She didn't answer, but didn't tell him to leave either. "I was afraid of what I'd find," he said again. "But that's not an excuse. I owe you. I owe her. The truth." Isabel folded her arms. "Then tell it." He exhaled. When Maria disappeared, I was 12. My grandmother told me she'd gone home, but I overheard my father arguing with her. He said things like, "We can't keep this buried forever," and she was just a girl. That night, he sat me down and said, "Some people's lives don't leave records, son. It's better not to ask."
He looked down.
I stopped asking, and I never started again, until now. Isabel watched him quietly. "You were a boy, but you're not anymore." "I know," he said. "That's why I've decided to open the mansion to the public, as a historical site, but also as a memorial." She raised an eyebrow. "You think that's enough?" He shook his head. "Nothing will be, but maybe it's a beginning." She looked away, unsure what to feel. She didn't trust him, not fully, but maybe for once the right thing was happening. As she walked past him to leave the room, he said one more thing. "She wore that locket every day. I found it in her things. You should have it." He held out a small velvet pouch. Inside was the pearl-studded locket, still intact. Isabel accepted it without a word and walked away. That night, she stood in her apartment, holding the locket in one hand and Maria's rosary in the other.
She opened her laptop.
The blank screen blinked at her. She began typing. She was 25 when the world forgot her. But this story is not about forgetting. It's about remembering. As she typed, her phone buzzed. A message from Daphne. "I'm lighting a candle for her tonight. Join me from where you are." Isabel lit a small white candle and placed it on the windowsill. Outside, the stars blinked softly above the Georgia horizon. Somewhere out there, Maria's soul was finally free. Weeks passed. The Savannah District Attorney's Office released an official statement acknowledging the role of Eileen Harrison in Maria Alvarez's death. Though the statute of limitations had long passed for several related crimes, and with both primary suspects deceased, no prosecution would follow. But the public outcry led to something unexpected. A statewide push to re-examine cold cases involving domestic workers, especially women of color who had vanished or died under suspicious circumstances during the 1950s through 1980s. Maria's name appeared in congressional hearings. Her face, taken from the black and white photo, once hidden in a tin box, became the face of the forgotten, a symbol of the silenced. At a town hall in Savannah, Isabel spoke before a full room. "My great-aunt wasn't famous. She didn't have money. She didn't leave behind children or accolades. But she mattered. She had a voice, a love, a diary. And for 45 years, that voice was trapped behind a mirror. If this city, this state, wants to be more than history books and charm tours, it needs to start by listening to the stories it buried." The audience stood when she finished. Among them were former housekeepers, grandmothers, and sons of women who never came home. That night, Savannah took its first step toward honoring the invisible labor that held its pillars up for generations. The Harrison estate was officially converted into a heritage site in the spring of the following year. At Isabel's request, Room 3C, the maid's quarters, was restored to match the exact photos and descriptions found in Maria's diary. The hidden compartment in the wall was preserved and turned into a display behind glass, now containing only a plaque. For Maria Alvarez, 1950-1975, silenced but never erased. Tour guides told her story to visitors. Journalists wrote long-form pieces, and school children left flowers at her memorial. One Sunday morning, Isabel returned with Daphne. The sky was blue, the azaleas in bloom. They walked through the quiet halls until they reached the memorial room. They stood in silence. "She was always braver than me," Daphne whispered. "She stayed. I ran." "You survived," Isabel replied, "and you remembered." Daphne reached for Isabel's hand and gave it a light squeeze. "Do you ever wonder what she would have been like if she'd gotten out?" Daphne asked. Isabel looked around the room. "I think she would have become someone who helped others escape. Maybe she already did." Outside, the wind stirred gently through the trees. Sunlight hit the stained glass just right, casting a warm glow across the wooden floor. It felt peaceful, not haunted. Later that evening, Isabel visited Maria's grave. She brought fresh daisies, the kind Maria had written she loved. She knelt beside the headstone and took out the locket Edward had returned. She opened it. Inside were two small photos, one of Maria and one of her parents, long dead in Mexico. Isabel placed the locket at the base of the stone, nestled it into the soil. She closed her eyes. "I found you," she whispered. "And the world knows now. You weren't crazy. You weren't a servant. You weren't disposable. You were a woman. You were loved. And you were strong." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. When she opened her eyes again, the sky was darkening. Stars blinked slowly into view. She stood, took a breath, and walked back toward her car. Maria Alvarez had been found. The mirror was broken. And behind it, the truth had finally seen the light.